Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. On September 11, 2001, we were shocked when airplanes crashed into New York's World Trade Center, into the Pentagon, and into the ground in Pennsylvania. The very next day, Dick Cheney said we had to respond by going to war against Iraq. And Bush told us to just go shopping while he would conduct endless wars. Ordinary people put flags outside their houses and attached "United We Stand" stickers to their vehicles. Bush told us that if we're not with his policies, then we're against the United States. The government and mainstream media and American culture all emphasize the need for patriotism and rallying around the flag. The very next month, Bush launched a war against Afghanistan, and Congress passed the Patriot Act, a very, very long piece of legislation, without even reading it. Everything was happening at once. People felt overwhelmed. However, soon after September 11, people started noticing that some of the evidence the government had put forth for us was really pretty bizarre. People started asking questions and challenging some aspects that seemed kind of fishy. But people were not getting credible answers. The official orthodoxy for the past 7 years has been that it's not okay to ask questions. But a 9/11 truth movement has been growing ever since, and increasing numbers of people have been questioning the official story, researching it, and based on the evidence, many people have concluded that a number of elements within the official story are not only fishy but really discredited, and that the government knew the September 11 tragedy was coming and allowed it to occur. Different people with different pieces of evidence have come to various conclusions, but all are feeling encouraged by the excitement of finding information and answers and discovering the truth as they're discovering it. The official culture wants all of us to dismiss these people as conspiracy theorists, but the vast majority of people doing this research are thoughtful, credible people, many with excellent backgrounds in the government, in military, in the intelligence community, in engineering of buildings, in aviation, all kinds of professional backgrounds. And they've studied the facts, and they're finding holes in the official theory. So 7 years later, it seems about time to be asking, is it okay to ask questions now? And that's what we'll do on this program. We have two guests who have been researching this quite a lot and have been discovering evidence that they want to share with us. And we encourage the viewers to make up your own minds and do your own research. I'm very happy to welcome Terry Macinata and Drew Gibbs. Both have been researching and studying this, and they will share what they've discovered. They'll ask some challenging questions and help us explore the evidence. We believe, all three of us believe, that it's okay to ask questions, that it's okay to pursue the truth and see where it goes. And that's what this program will do. Happy to welcome Terry Macinata and Drew Gibbs.
Thank you. Thanks.
Terry, you wanted to begin by acknowledging the loss of life on September 11 as sort of a starting grounding point.
Thanks, Glenn. It seems like a lot of times people forget to acknowledge the fact that about 3,000 people died on that day from about 90 different countries. And it wasn't just numbers, it wasn't just bodies. These were family members. These were mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, close friends. It's an amazing experience that happened, and I just wanted to acknowledge the human element of that.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. That's a kind of a grounding point. Both of you have been looking at the September 11 issues with really open minds and a lot of curiosity and real intellectual rigor. And you're willing to consider the evidence and ask the hard questions. What do you do when people say, well, you must be some kind of a conspiracy theorist or some kind of a nut to be doing that? How do you respond to that?
It's a question I love to answer because the fact of the matter is all of the theories, and that's what they are at this point, about what happened on 9/11 are conspiracy theories by definition. The fact is that not just one person did it, that a number of people had to conspire to do it. So whether you believe that 19 hijackers were the only people involved or not, that's a conspiracy of 19, plus, say, bin Laden. So no matter what way you look at it, it's a conspiracy theory. The question really is it nuts to think about the event of 9/11 in any way other than the official explanation? And I think that's what we're going to explore today.
Oh, of course not. A guy named John McMurtry, he wrote an article in an interesting book in the 9/11 Truth Movement, and he says conspiracy theory is the stigma term used to fence off the taboo zone of 9/11. And I do find that 9/11 and questioning of 9/11 just doesn't naturally come up in conversation. There's an easy way to, if it's on your mind and you want to open a discussion, just say, so what's your take on 9/11? It's okay, we can discuss this,
Yeah, but you're right, you use the word taboo, and it really does seem to be a taboo to question the orthodoxy.
Well, there's so many angles. Media-wise, I think there's credibility issues, so, boy.
Yeah, it's a common thing for people to think that if someone disagrees with them, they're either stupid or nuts. And the fact of the matter is they may just have different life experience, they may have read different books, and it's important for us to put information together to come up with what really happened.
Yeah, it's amazing how much information is out there, and when we decided to go ahead and do this program, I've been studying as much as I could, and it's just enormous, but a lot of it is surprisingly well-founded by people with real credentials,
Absolutely.
real expertise in aviation, real expertise in building engineering and architecture and government intelligence people, and we'll get into some of that.
Right.
Drew, I wonder if you could just lay out the official story very succinctly so that we have some context for the rest of this program.
Well, let's see. We had it was 9/11 attacks were a series of coordinated suicide attacks by Al-Qaeda on the United States. On that morning, suicide extremists, 19 Arab radical fundamentalists, hijacked 4 airplanes. They crashed 2 airplanes into the World Trade Center Twin Towers, killing everyone on board the planes and many people inside the towers. 3 of the buildings in the World Trade Center complex collapsed due to structural failure. this is the official story we're talking about again. Let's see, the North Tower, the South Tower collapsed after 56 minutes of fires. The North Tower after 102 minutes of fires. World Trade Center Building 7, which we'll get into a little bit later, that collapsed later that day. Maybe a lot of people don't know too much about Building 7, but it was damaged by debris from the North Tower when it collapsed, and then it sustained localized moderate fires throughout the day. It collapsed around 5:20.
It was never hit by an airplane.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. The third plane went on to strike the Pentagon. Fourth plane, as you were saying, crashed near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And allegedly, after the passengers and some of the flight crew attempted to retake control of the hijacked plane, it crashed. They were, I think, heading to Washington, D.C., it's been said. Let's see.
That's enough to give us
Sure.
the basic pattern, just to refresh people's memories so that we know we have
I'd
something
just like to add
respond.
one small thing to that, and that is that the official story is that the government really had no idea that terrorists would use planes to crash into buildings.
Right. Yeah, it was a bolt out of the blue. It came as a total surprise.
Right,
And we'll get into that in
absolutely.
very soon. We'll get into that. I was surprised on September 11 and the next very few days afterwards that the government had identified 19 people who had done it, the alleged hijackers. They had detailed information about all these guys. What does the evidence say about the alleged hijackers?
Well, the first thing is that, as you point out, it's amazing that they were able to come up with that information right away. And people that we've investigated have indicated that it was as if the trail were left on purpose, okay? And I leave it to the viewer to go into some of the research. They can find that information even more themselves. But that is a part of it that I think was really important.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Within hours after the attacks, they had apparently found Muhammad Atta's luggage. It didn't make the transfer from his early morning flight to catch Flight 11, which crashed in the North Tower. They found in his luggage papers detailing many personal details about the 19 suicide hijackers, their plans, motives, things like that. So it's very interesting.
Well, and it had his will.
Had his
in it,
will,
and it had a manual of operating the airplane
Sure,
or something.
sure,
But
yeah.
if that was the intention of that, presumably, according to the government story, was that was going to be that was in the luggage. So that would have been in the cargo hold of a plane that he was going to be crashing. If you're committing suicide, why would you have your will with you in the airplane that you're going to be crashing? And if you need a manual to fly the plane, why would you put that in the luggage that would be in the cargo hold?
Right, yeah.
And why would you have all this evidence? And then convenently that was left behind at the commuter
Right.
flight.
Well,
in,
yeah, didn't make the
Portland,
transfer.
Maine, or someplace.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, Fishy, I was struck that same day that they said they found the passport of one of the guys directly below where the airplane had hit.
Yeah,
The airplane had
heard
hit
that,
on, very, very high up on the
Yeah,
building. I don't
yeah.
know, I don't recall what floor, but way up there.
Well, I think it was within 3 blocks in any event.
Well,
But it was in an area.
The news story had said directly below.
Oh, well, okay.
The news story that I heard, because I heard this on a reputable station.
Yeah.
And they said it was right below. And I thought, well, how would that have happened? Because when the building collapsed,
It blew everything out.
it was this enormous building and whoosh and big windstorms and the dust and stuff. And here was this guy's passport. It had apparently fallen out of his pocket or something, out of the airplane when it hit the thing.
Yeah.
But instead of being burned in the fire, it fell exactly straight below and was not singed.
Right.
It was actually one of 2 passports that was found in pristine condition.
Yeah.
The other one was found at the Pentagon, and in the midst of incredible debris and destruction. So, yeah, that doesn't fly. And it was also a pyroclastic cloud, by the way, that emanated from the World Trade Center, and that means that it was an extremely hot cloud, and it actually burned a number of people and set fire to cars in that area. So how could a passport made of paper survive?
Yeah. Is there other information that you're aware of that these guys may have been misidentified?
Well, Exactly. In fact, at last count, I came across 9 individuals of the original 19 who credible sources say are still alive.
Well, some guys had seen their name in print and their photos in print, and they contacted the press or
Yeah.
the government or whatever and said, I'm alive and well, I'm living in Egypt now, or I'm
Or
living
Saudi
in Saudi
Arabia,
Arabia or whatever.
exactly.
I mean, a number of guys did that. They said, that's not me. I mean, you've got somebody's using my identity, but it's not.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, there's.
And those guys still appeared listed in the 9/11 Commission report
Well, yeah. And
several years later. The official.
yeah, that's one of the many anomalies. There are so many that obviously books have been written about this. And what we're going to cover tonight, although I've investigated this somewhere around 200 hours, I have just barely gotten to the point where I'm able to connect some of the dots.
And my understanding is that although the official story says Osama bin Laden was behind it, that he has not been charged because the FBI says they don't have enough evidence to actually
Absolutely.
Well,
yeah.
pursue a charge.
If you
a
go
criminal
to the
charge.
website for the FBI and actually look this up, you'll see that there are other charges against him, but nothing having to do with 9/11. Why?
Okay. Now, the two twin towers, Building 1, the North Tower, and Building 2, the South Tower, were hit by different airplanes relatively few minutes apart, and they collapsed in just a few seconds. I mean, the collapse time was just a few seconds, just like if you had dropped a bowling ball off, it just like
Just
the rate of
slightly
gravity.
longer than that. Yeah, absolutely.
But the official story blames the damage to the vertical steel columns and the fire. And what can either of you tell us about
I could start
critiques
off.
of that evidence?
Yeah,
Good-
by
good
one,
start.
one thing. Well, one thing to realize is that, contrary to a common conception, the towers were actually very well built. John Skilling, the lead structural engineer of the building, said they took jet plane crashes and jet fuel fires into account, and that the building structure would still be there if such an event occurred.
And comparable sized jets too, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely.
707,
Yeah.
which was the big jet
It's
of that
huge.
era, but,
Yeah.
Yeah.
but about the same
Yeah.
the same amount of
Yeah.
physical force.
Right.
Because although the jet that hit it was bigger, the 707 flew at a higher rate of speed, so it's about equal.
You had these 47 steel core columns going from the bottom to the top, interconnected with cross bracing, very strong core structure. You also had the very strong perimeter columns. So, I mean, these buildings were over-designed.
By a factor of at least 10. Yeah, at least 10. So it'd have to, the structure would have had to have been weakened by more than 90% in order for a collapse to occur.
But the official story is alleging that only several of the upright columns were severed by the plane.
One of the many problems with their
Right.
story.
Yeah, maybe 15% or something like that.
Yeah. And then if the fire were the cause, you think that it would be a really hot fire, but you see photos showing that it was black, and black is what you get from a fire that's
Black
oxygen
smoke.
starved. Black
Right.
smoke
Right,
shows that it's
right.
oxygen starved,
Yeah.
so it's not burning efficiently and therefore not burning hot.
Yeah.
What else can you tell us about fire?
Well, I mean, from the minuscule amount of steel that they actually did save from the rubble, they did test some of that steel that was particularly picked from the fire zones, and I think maybe 2% of that steel only saw temperatures above 250 degrees Celsius, far lower than any kind of temperatures that would compromise the strength of steel.
Exactly.
At any rate, I was going to mention about NIST's, like you correctly said, their
The
theory is a column
National
failure theory.
Institute of Standards and Technology.
That's right. That's
NIST.
right. Yeah, it's a governmental agency that investigated the collapses of the towers and filed their report.
10,000 pages.
10,000 pages, $20 million, and well-funded report. You're right. It's a column failure theory. That's as opposed to the FEMA's earlier study, which was a truss failure theory, where you had the trusses that connected the core columns and the perimeter columns, the connections failing, that compromising and then unzipping around the building. Then you've got floor collapse leading to this pancake collapse. The NIST theory is different. It says that it's a column failure theory. So you've got these floors that are sagging up to 42 inches, they say, and then pulling the columns inward, and that starting the downward progression. So there are two different theories. The main point I wanted to make is that...
And those are two different official theories.
Absolutely, two different official theories, right. Thank you for the clarification. Kevin Ryan, who worked for Underwriters Laboratories, worked in conjunction with NIST in their testing of floor model assemblies, and they subjected these floor models to intense fire and even had more weight on the floors than were probably on the World Trade Center floors. And their physical tests, it didn't collapse. It sagged maybe 3 or 4 inches. So Kevin Ryan points out that NIST's investigation, where they say that it sagged 42 inches and then pulled columns inward, directly contradicts the physical tests that they did.
My understanding also is that steel conducts heat very well, and because it was so much cross-braced with trusses and columns and all these things, that heat from a fire would have actually dissipated and not stayed at a very
Absolutely.
central point.
That's right.
I've had some experience in welding, and I can tell you it takes a long time of very, very hot temperatures, and we're talking about blue flame hot, in order to melt steel. I mean, it's really not that easy. And the ambient air temperature of a carbon-based fire is not going to do it. You have to add pure oxygen to it to get it to that level. So it's just, it doesn't really make sense when you add it all up.
And what about the pancake thing, the idea that each floor dropped on the next floor and dropped and dropped and dropped? I've read many times a rebuttal of that based on laws of physics.
Well, you know, it's a very interesting theory, and you know, the way that I said it earlier, which I'll repeat again, is that you really can't have a pancake theory without pancakes. I'm not talking about the flour and wheat ones. You know, we're talking about the floors themselves, because if you look at photographs or video of buildings that have pancaked because of earthquakes, you'll see that they have stacked themselves down, okay? But they're still physically present. They're not blown apart and into minuscule particles. So that theory is really very, very easily disproven.
Right. What
And
happened?
we want to talk about the concrete too.
Right. Yeah. What happened is we ended up with a lot of dust.
Absolutely.
And a fire doesn't turn concrete into dust.
Well, there's only one way that it can, and that's if you have high moisture content of concrete and you have high temperature. And this was a building that was over 40 years old. So really, it's very difficult to imagine, although it may be remotely possible. You won't have it in all of the concrete. And what we find in the World Trade Center buildings is that the concrete was absolutely pulverized. You take a look at the photos of the South Tower. When the top part fell off, it disintegrated before it reached the ground. Now, I just want you to think, stop for a moment and think, how can, 40 floors, 30 floors disappear before they hit the ground? There's no more, the collapsing is all below it. So how does it disappear? It was not found in the rubble. The only way you can explain that is by explosives. It appears to me.
Well, one thing I'll just note, and we'll probably note this as we go, there really are a large number of people now studying this very thing with people with credentials, people with scientific backgrounds, physicists, architects, engineers. You know, this is not, you know, just us, you know, this is a lot of people. You know what I mean?
Well, absolutely. When I investigated this, I purposely started Googling concrete explosions. And I found the conditions that I set forward earlier. And the interesting thing is that when you put concrete under pressure, you might logically think that it could explode. But in fact, what happens in reality is it fractures. And that's what we see happening time and time again in photographs where an actual collapse occurred.
Yeah, and this produced more dust. There's evidence, there are theories that have been put forth about controlled demolition for a whole bunch of reasons. And can you summarize some of the evidence that suggests why this might have been explosives
Well,
in the building and in controlled demolition.
Well, I could quickly say, we were just talking about the pulverization of the concrete. One thing that one of the main researchers that I've read and listened to, Jim Hoffman, he says, even if you did have, he's talking about the thing to point out about the column failure theory, is that even if you did somehow have these high temperatures somehow compromising a column or two, you wouldn't get this sudden onset, this straight down telescoping collapse with this intense pulverization right from the beginning all the way down through the path of greatest resistance. That's something to know.
Yeah, even if you were thinking that pulverization was possible, it would happen at the bottom, not at the top. That's an important thing, because the greater the acceleration, the more likelihood you would have that pulverization. But it occurred immediately. And another point to make is that there were steel beams and steel structures, 20, 50 tons, that were thrown 500 feet away from that building. Now, use your imagination for a moment. Imagine that gravity is bringing down the building, and that's the only force, really, that was indicated by the official theories, gravity. How would gravity cause 20 and 50-ton structures to be cast horizontally 500 feet? Makes no sense.
You got something on this card to share.
If we've got the time,
Yes.
sure. Okay,
Yeah,
great.
We're running tight, but
sure.
But this is
Yeah,
crucial.
this is just an informational card that a group called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth puts out. This is their case for explosive demolition of the World Trade Center towers. A lot of things we've just been discussing. 1, sudden onset of destruction. 2, destruction occurred at near freefall pace. 3, destruction followed path of greatest resistance. 4, perimeter column steel ejected laterally up to 500 feet. 5, blast waves blew out windows in buildings 400 feet away. 6, 118 first responders reported explosions at the onset of the destruction. 7, numerous eyewitness reports of flowing molten metal in the rubble. 8, midair pulverization of concrete without outward arching plumes. 9, rapid expansion and pyroclastic flow of enormous dust clouds. 10, squibs, explosive
Mention what a
ejection.
squib is.
Well, it's these explosive ejections 40 stories below the collapse zone that you can see shooting out on
It's
video.
puffs of explosion.
Absolutely,
popping out,
yeah.
yeah.
It's very helpful to review video to conceptualize
you
the
can-
things we're
you
talking
can,
about.
You can see that when you look for
Yeah,
it.
absolutely.
Yeah, all this stuff is visible.
Yeah, absolutely. Total dismemberment of the steel core column structures. A 1,200-foot diameter symmetrical debris field. 13, chemical evidence of thermate on steel and in dust samples. 14, FEMA steel analysis indicated sulfidation, oxidation, and intergranular melting. And 15, no precedent for steel frame high-rise collapse caused by fire.
Never in the history of the world.
That's right.
So-
Never before had it happened
Yeah.
that a steel frame structure like that had collapsed by fire, and it happened 3 times allegedly on that one day.
Yeah.
And this was from Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, and they have a
Right.
website
Yeah.
that we'll list at the end of the program, and also people can contact the Olympia.
Is this the time to
Fellowship
talk
of
about the
Reconciliation.
thermate a little bit more?
Yeah, let me just give that website. It's www.ae911truth.org. Don't expect you to write it down right now, but it's there, and this is our architects and engineers.
Yeah.
I've seen stuff from metallurgists, PhD metallurgists, and others who say, well, this is fishy, this is fishy.
If you look at some of the video of the World Trade Center, you'll see molten metal coming out. Now, the official theory says that that's from aluminum, but aluminum doesn't have that color when it's molten. However, thermate does. And Stephen Jones has a video, Professor Stephen Jones, he's a physicist. He has a video that clearly shows exactly the same color in that video.
Really interesting. Really good
Yeah.
point. Yeah, it's just pouring out of the tower this bright orange metallic dripping substance for maybe a minute or two.
It's not explained by the official
No, because
theory.
there's
They tried.
nothing warm enough to cause the molten, except the possibility of aluminum. But again, it's the wrong color.
Yeah. There's another odd thing. The North Tower had a tall antenna on it, and that antenna, and this was some number of floors above where the airplane struck,
Yeah.
and that antenna at the top of the North Tower started to drop before the rest of the building did.
Yeah.
So what did it know already? What
Well,
was going on inside that would cause that to start dropping?
Yeah,
Exactly.
the theory that that people like Stephen Jones and the people doing this research in the 9/11 Truth Movement would say is that, well, the antenna, and you're talking about the North Tower, I believe, is sitting on the core. It's sitting on the core columns. In controlled demolition, that's what they do. They pull the core,
Yeah.
and they pull core
And
columns.
that seems that I can't think of any other explanation that would satisfy that other than that the core columns were cut.
Well, one interesting note is that we were just talking about the NIST investigation, the official investigation to find out. They actually stopped short in their investigation. They didn't look at the things that we're talking about right now. They only analyzed from the point of the plane crashes until the buildings were poised for collapse.
Yeah, and that's their quotation.
Yeah,
Poised for collapse.
Poised for collapse, and then global collapse ensued.
Yeah.
Once they got it to start, then it just, we saw it, it just happened.
Right.
you
But
know.
they don't explain why, if a floor falls and a floor falls and a floor falls and a floor, why there's not resistance from the floor below.
Absolutely.
They don't explain
Yeah.
any of these other things
That's right.
that we're talking
That's
about.
right.
They just say, well, it was poised for collapse, and then we'll just drop it
Well,
there.
and a university study did indicate that it would take a minimum of 90 seconds for the building to collapse, given that there would be some amount of resistance on each floor. So there's another bit of evidence.
Yeah, another interesting thing, Bush has a brother, Marvin, who is a principal in a company that was providing security for the World Trade Center, and a cousin, Wirt Walker III,
Right,
who was
right.
also in the same company.
That's
And
right.
these guys were
Well, yeah.
somehow involved with, I mean, they were the
Well,
company providing the security.
it is very interesting. Yeah, Marvin Bush from '93 till 2000 was a principal in Securicom.
Yeah.
They ran the electronic security in the World Trade Center and Dulles Airport, both involved in 9/11. And then Wirt D. Walker III was the CEO of Securicom
Yeah. And
from '99 till 2002.
And
So
there's
it's
several
interesting.
suspicious things related to that. I
Interesting.
want to talk about Building 7 that most people, or I don't know most people, many people don't realize had collapsed because that was later on in the day and it was not hit by an airplane,
Right.
so it did not get the publicity. But Building 7, which was 47 stories tall, that's a huge
It is.
skyscraper.
Yeah.
And very strong, collapsed in the afternoon. It had caught fire from some debris that kind of blew into it.
Right.
But it wasn't this horrendous fire. There have been bigger fires in skyscrapers elsewhere that have burned more of the building and longer periods
Absolutely,
of time
absolutely.
than this, and this thing collapsed.
Well, two things I want to mention before we go any further with this is that, first of all, Building 7 was not right next to World Trade Center 1.
Right.
There was a building separated it. And why didn't the building that was closest to World Trade Center 1 fall instead of Building 7? And the other thing about World Trade Center 7 is that the fire wasn't on the top floor. Now, if debris fell from the top of World Trade Center 1 to World Trade Center 7, why weren't the top floors affected? And which floor was it that was affected? The 11th floor or something like that?
Are you talking about the new investigation that came out? The
Well,
13th floor
Yeah,
is where the
floor.
failure occurred.
Yeah, the 13th floor. So how do you explain fire on the 13th floor from debris that came from World Trade Center 1 and nothing happened to the top of it? I don't, it just doesn't add up.
Is this the time when we can look at your
sure.
Absolutely.
your video about the collapse of the building? Tell us what we're going to see,
Okay.
and what we might be looking for in this.
Yeah, well, this is just a real short clip. I've got two little angles here of the collapse of Building 7. And just to kind of see, it did collapse at almost literally free fall speed, which is, if you consider the 47, I'm sorry, that was the towers. It had 25 central columns, 58 perimeter columns. It was built in 1985 to the then current building codes. This is not a flimsy building. So, yeah, basically I just want to show it so people can see that it really does.
Well, and in putting this a little more context, there are other buildings in World Trade Center complex that had fires more severe than Building 7
Absolutely,
by
absolutely.
far.
Sure.
And none of those steel structures collapsed. None of them.
Right.
Okay.
Absolutely.
That's important to
Let's take a
remember.
look at
Sure.
what we can
Sure,
see here.
sure. One thing you might notice besides the symmetry about it is just you can see, maybe you'd call these squibs just kind of running up the side and the front. So I'll play that. Okay. So there's one clip there. That's probably the clearest clip that we have.
And by the way, there are only a few companies in the entire world that can perform that kind of demolition so
right.
precisely.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, you just don't walk up to somebody and say, "Would you help me demolish this building?"
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's if it does look like a controlled demolition, they didn't run up and throw it
Right.
all together that day. This takes weeks of preparation.
Yeah, I have a quotation. After we've seen, go
Oh,
ahead
sure,
and show
sure.
this next thing, and I want to share a quotation that I ran
Sure.
across.
Now this is an acknowledged controlled demolition on the right, and this is World Trade Center Building 7. So you can kind of see the
And they're
similarity.
of comparable height, apparently.
Yeah, absolutely.
My God.
So yeah, that's interesting.
So in the research I was doing to prepare for this program, I ran across in a book by David Ray Griffin about debunking the 9/11 debunking.
Yeah,
He has there's an interview there with a professional from Holland who has 27 years of experience in the demolition business, including owning his own company. And somebody had shown him a video of Building 7 collapsing, but without saying what it was. And it wasn't well known. It didn't get the publicity that
Right.
Towers 1 and 2 got. And so this guy said, this is the building demolition expert with 27 years of experience. He says, it starts from below. They've simply blown away columns. A team of experts did this. This is a controlled demolition. And he didn't know at all about Building 7. And he was told, and later examined the evidence further and said, this is professional work without any doubt. These boys know very well what they do. And it's just like you said, very few people can do this.
Yeah,
I mean, this is not an accident. This is not fire damage.
that's right.
No.
This is not.
That's right.
And the other thing is that fire damage causes asymmetrical damage. Okay, so when you have an asymmetrical fire, you have to have an asymmetrical collapse.
Yeah, so it'll
Yeah.
fall over or it'll
Twist to the
Yeah.
one side or whatever.
Yeah, and
This
these things
didn't.
straight down.
Yeah.
We're running a bit tight. I want to see if we can do something about the Pentagon and something about Pennsylvania, and see if we can maybe do these kind of briefly. The official story says that an airplane was hacked, they hijacked, the hijackers turned it away from the original course, aimed it toward Washington, D.C., and then it descended in this very tight spiral and hit the Pentagon.
That's right.
What does the evidence show about this official story?
It raises a lot of questions because, first of all, it was not just a little bit of a circle. It was 270 degrees. So, and it was at a dive.
So 270, that's 3/4 of a way around a circle.
3/4 of a circle, yeah. And a Top Gun flight instructor said he would have great difficulty or something to that effect, or maybe that he couldn't even perform that flight maneuver. Now, it just really more than tests our credibility to think that an individual who supposedly could not even fly a Cessna made that maneuver.
Yeah, the guy that the government says did it had a notoriously bad reputation as a totally incompetent pilot when he was trying to fly a Cessna.
He
small
tried
plane.
3 times to qualify for a solo flight so that he could rent a Cessna, and he failed.
Yeah, Hani Hanjour. I mean,
Exactly.
the hijacker pilots all trained here in the U.S. So yeah, I think there's a number of military and civilian pilots that have looked at this. There's actually a website, an organization called Pilots for 9/11 Truth, where they talk about that and other things too.
Yeah.
What about evidence of something else at the Pentagon? It hit an area that had been was in the process of being remodeled or under really massive reconstructions. There could have been something inserted at that time. Some people say, or some people say a missile may have hit it or whatever. I know based on what I've read, what they found didn't match what the airplane was supposed to be.
When I first started investigating it, I was struck by the idea that somewhere between an 18 and 22-foot hole was all that was present when immediately after the crash. Okay, it was some 45 minutes later that a larger section of the Pentagon fell. Then, as I investigated it further, I found that not all. Most of the photographs are of small areas of the Pentagon. The Pentagon is huge, and that area that was affected is a fairly large area. So it seemed like that the first photographs showed a small area, but that in fact didn't show the first floor. And when there were eyewitnesses indicating that the first floor was struck, which would have to indicate that the landing gear collapsed at that point. I mean, it would be miraculous for that craft to be able to have flown in at that place, I think 6 inches above the ground level, and hit the way that it did. So that's another factor that plays a part in there.
Yeah, the whole issue around the Pentagon and the issues around the Pentagon have been debated very much. There's no shortage of research in this area. What I come away with, and again, I'll mention Jim Hoffman's site, 911research.wtc7.net, and you can read an article called "The Pentagon Attack: What the Physical Evidence Shows." I think a lot of people now in the truth movement, and again, this is kind of a divisive issue, so there's people that are on both sides as to what hit the Pentagon. There's actually quite a bit of evidence, including eyewitness evidence, that saw an American airplane, I believe American Airlines plane, a 757, probably Flight 77, go into the Pentagon. At least you could say there's not enough evidence to disprove it. So there's a lack of data, as Stephen Jones said. So that in itself is.
Yeah, I've seen
actually
conflicting information about the landing gear and where it was and what might have caused what damage. But even if it was that airplane, some folks have said that the pilot, the guy who was supposed to be piloting it, was totally incompetent and never could have pulled off that maneuver.
Absolutely.
So how did it get there? And
Well,
some people have said
there
it
are
was
other
control
questions. There are other questions too, like why wasn't it shot down?
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know?
they have extensive anti-aircraft batteries, just a very heavily guarded area.
Yep.
And then there are videotapes from surrounding areas that the government confiscated and won't let anybody watch.
Right.
That's true.
And the defensive mechanisms for the Pentagon were set automatically, so that unless an aircraft had a transponder operating, it would be shot down. That's the way that it was supposedly set up, from what I could gather. Okay. So
We're running pretty tight. I want to do something about Pennsylvania and then look at some other concerns. The official story says that a fourth airplane was hijacked that morning, but some of the passengers and crew overpowered the hijackers, tried to fix things, but for whatever reason the thing crashed. What's the evidence around that crash site or about anything else that we may know?
Well, I'd like to state at the outset that the story of people taking heroic measures to take control of that aircraft are extremely honorable, and anybody who is willing to risk their life to do something like that, I honor. The unfortunate situation is that the evidence seems to indicate that when you look at the crash site, there's nothing there. Eyewitnesses said there's nothing here in this crash hole that would indicate that an aircraft crashed here. Nothing. And yet you find debris 6 and 8 miles away. So that really calls into question the idea that it crashed and was destroyed on impact. The evidence seems to show that if you take a look at the original timeline, that there was plenty of time, and there were eyewitnesses to indicate that one of the F-series fighters was close to that aircraft and fired a missile at it and destroyed it in the air. And that's why you have a debris field that covers a diameter of some 16 miles.
Yeah, the crash site itself is a crater. It's like a hole
Small.
in the ground, as if something had had gone pretty much straight down. Well, not quite exactly.
It could have been scooped out.
Yeah, but it's not like what you'd have if a plane crashed because there were no big parts left.
If you look at the crash photos of the Lockerbie, Scotland crash and compare that, the difference is remarkable. Even the windshield of the airliner that crashed in Lockerbie was still intact, and a large section of the nose cone. And in this case, in the Shankville area, we find nothing bigger than a telephone book for, like I said, 6 to 8 miles out.
And again, something I was reading in one of David Ray Griffin's book, the Debunking 9/11 Debunking, he said that a passport and a red bandana belonging to one of the alleged hijackers was found at the crash site.
Yeah.
Now here there's no debris, but the guy's passport and his red bandana.
Well, I guess the question is which crash site. There were at least 2 crash sites that they had cordoned off. And there is evidence that the military, I think it's well known that the military was in a position to shoot it down if need be.
Okay. We're running quite late, as we thought we might be, because there's so much information to share.
Yeah, right.
We want to do something on the 9/11 Commission. It's just, I mean, this was like the biggest catastrophe on U.S. mainland in terms of a single event, pivotal point. And you would think that you'd want to have an investigation, and the Bush and Cheney administration just vigorously opposed having any official investigation of this.
Yeah.
And when an investigation the commission was finally formed, they were obstructing it in every possible way they could. They tried to have Henry Kissinger as the executive director of it, and of course he has a whole lot of clients in Saudi Arabia's government and oil business and so forth.
Yeah.
They finally came up with this guy named Zelikow, who actually had worked for Condoleezza Rice and had written a report in 1998 saying, if we're going to change things the way Condoleezza Rice and some other people want to change things, it's going to take like a new Pearl Harbor, that something so massive that the public will go along with these massive changes. And this was the guy that they put in as executive director of the 9/11 Commission, and the information I was reading said that he was the only candidate seriously considered. And then even when they got the commission going, Bush and Cheney refused to testify. And I have an email that I brought up from my files from, it was one of these email action alert kinds of things I got from Common Cause. It's a good government organization I belonged to since 1969 when it first started. And they put out this thing in April 9, 2004, Common Cause put out this thing that wanted us to, click here and tell Bush and Cheney that they should be complying with the needs of the 9/11 Commission, because they'd been refusing, not letting Condoleezza Rice testify, not doing whatever.
Sure.
And it just went on and on. I mean, I won't read the whole thing, but they had just obstructed in every possible way they could the 9/11 Commission.
Yeah. That's right.
I mean, that's pretty fishy.
Oh, absolutely.
What else can you tell us about the conflict of interest with the 9/11 Commission? And we are running really tight on time.
Well, I could just mention a little bit then about Zelikow. You were mentioning he was picked to be the executive director. And also the 2 co-chairs, Thomas Keane and Lee Hamilton, have certain conflicts of interest too that make you wonder why they were picked as the co-chairs. But just on Philip Zelikow, definitely you could say he's a White House insider. Like you said, he had worked with Condoleezza Rice in H.W. Bush's national security staff. He also worked with Condoleezza again in W. Bush's transition team in 2000-2001. They co-authored a book together. He's also the author of the Preemptive War Doctrine. Now that's about as inside the White House as you can get.
And that's this thing that Bush and Cheney cooked up that let them start the war against Iraq.
Oh, yeah.
Without paying attention to international law. So we don't have to do that. We can just do as we please.
That's right. It was his job, his responsibility to guide the research staff. So he kind of said, well, look over here, we'll investigate this. This is what we'll look into. But he had a lot of say about what they might avoid.
the 9/11 Commission ignored a lot of evidence, the kinds of stuff we're talking about, and a whole lot more. The families of the Twin Tower victims had created an organization, and they did a lot of research, and they came up with a number of questions that they wanted the commission to answer, and the commission just brushed them aside and wouldn't deal with that. What else do you know about where the 9/11 Commission ignored crucial evidence or had contradictions?
Well, one of the biggest things really is that they ignored the alternative theories for the reason for the collapse of the buildings and all of that. So, and they didn't follow up on the people who were in the FBI and others indicated were involved. A whistleblower by the name of Sidel Edmonds had
Sibel, S-I-B-D-E-L.
excuse me,
D
Sibel,
in the middle, yeah, Sibel.
She was a translator, and she indicated that she had read documents that clearly showed that the Bush administration had been made aware of the 9/11 event before it happened. Not on the exact date, I believe, but it was nevertheless that it was going to be involving aircraft and some of the places where I think were mentioned. And in fact, there's at least 6 areas where there was advanced knowledge of the event, and that information was completely ignored by the 9/11 Commission.
Well, I think somebody was mentioning earlier about all the different nations in their intelligence agencies
11
that actually did 11. Places like Russia, Israel, France, Germany, UK. They all, in various ways and various times, warned of attacks. You were mentioning Sibel Edmonds. There's a number of other FBI whistleblowers, you might say, and we don't necessarily need to go into that too much, but what you the picture that I get out of researching that is was this really a matter of a lack of communication and a lack of connecting dots, or as was the case with some of these whistleblowers, there was more of an obstruction from their higher-ups and things like that?
And then why would the Bush-Cheney folks and everybody keep insisting so stridently that this was just a bolt out of the blue? Nobody possibly could have guessed that this might have happened. They had no possible clue, no possible idea, and they kept emphasizing this.
Well, and in fact,
despite all this actual evidence that people said, no, we told you, here's the documents.
Yeah, there are numerous documents, and in fact, on that day, one of the exercises, one of maybe 7 exercises going on that day, was one that involved the hijacking of an aircraft.
These were like war game exercises.
Exactly.
And we're down to our last few minutes.
It crashed in, the scenario was for an airliner to crash into the headquarters of the National Reconnaissance Office in Washington, D.C.
So they were doing war games
Absolutely.
about the very kind of thing that happened, just in different locations.
And that's similar to what happened in 7/7/05 in London, by the way. They were conducting drills in the same locations at the same time that the bombings actually occurred.
Interesting.
We have just really a few minutes left, but I want to lift up the possibility that so many people are saying that this might be a false flag operation. A false flag operation is a violent act that's created by elements within one's own government in order to cause blame to some other government and allow the government to do some radical
With the time we have available, I would suggest that people Google false flag operations, and they will find a lot of information along these very lines.
plus 9/11, probably, yeah.
Sure.
It's just starting. When you look at the very many different ways that indicate this, conflicts of interest and how this allowed them to be, the Bush-Cheney folks to be doing what they wanted to do, which is attack Iran, Iraq. The U.S. bases in Afghanistan exactly line up along the route of the pipeline that they want to build across Afghanistan. All these kinds of things, security breaches that were happening. Why was Bush allowed to stay for so long in that elementary school? It was a public event, and you'd think that if the country was under attack, they'd want to whisk the president away to some safe place. But he stayed there and stayed there and stayed there and stayed there. So presumably he and the Secret Service knew that he was not really being in danger. I mean, that's the only possible explanation. Cheney was in some undisclosed location with And a lot of the, from what I've read, a lot of the responsibilities for major level intelligence and military operations had been delegated to him in advance of this.
Exactly. In
Right.
fact, Bush set it up that way so that he would have that ability to coordinate and work with various agencies.
Yeah, and then there are discrepancies in what I've read about where Cheney was at what time,
Yeah.
and what he might have been up to when time
Absolutely.
was not accounted for.
And
Absolutely.
one of the things that was really amazing too is that at one point, Norman Panetta was in the room with.
He was the U.S.
Yeah.
Secretary of Transportation.
Exactly, yeah. He was with Cheney,
Right.
and a young man came in periodically and said that there's a plane that's approaching the Pentagon. It's now 50 miles out, and come back a little later and said 30 miles out.
Yeah.
And Cheney dismissed him, saying, the order still stands.
Right.
What part of that didn't you understand? And
Yeah.
there were words to those effect.
Right. So there's something going on. That,
Yeah, right.
So there's the I know there are problems with Building 7 that we would want to talk about, and these things are
Right.
available.
Yeah.
But the buildings, the Twin Towers and Building 7, there were financial problems that the owner would have an interest in having those buildings go away. There is evidence against Enron being stored in Building 7, where the Securities and Exchange Commission had offices.
There's a
And
lot
so
of
all that
motive.
evidence went away.
It all gives rise to the idea of motive.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a lot of suspicious stuff, and it's one thing to speculate on. It's another thing to actually have evidence showing, yes, this is fishy and otherwise unexplainable.
Yeah, well,
And
that's
that's where you
why
go
we
with
have
it.
commissions on these things and official investigations. The problems with ours were that they were, very politically, they had their interests.
Yep.
in
And when you have evidence destroyed, I mean, at the World Trade Center, within 24 hours, they had, 140 truckloads hauled out. We have, let's see, it was an Associated Press writer, Leslie Miller, indicated that, according to her sources, an FAA quality assurance manager came in where there was a tape of air traffic controllers' conversations on 9/11. He crushed that cassette in his hand, cut the tape up into many pieces, and put the pieces in multiple trash cans. Why would he do that?
Destruction of evidence.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. These things that go above and beyond what you would expect reasonable people to do, especially around
Right,
a
right,
crime
absolutely.
event.
Sure.
It's challenging for people to have to consider these kinds of things, and yet I know as we were preparing for the show, we kept saying, well, you got to just get the information and pursue the truth no matter where it goes. And
I
I
have
know
some
that's
quotations.
what we're all. We don't have time for the quotations.
Oh, okay. All
We're
right.
just really very
Okay.
tight on the time.
Okay.
But we just want to encourage. I know all three of us we want to encourage the viewers to look at these really good websites. They'll be able to. They'll run quickly at the end of the credits.
Right.
But people can contact the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation
Great.
and get those, and not worry about. Quote, conspiracy theory, because as you said at the beginning of the show, the official theory is a conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
It's a matter of which one has better evidence.
Right.
And there's a Zogby poll from May of 2006 that found that 42% of the people believe that the U.S. government and its 9/11 Commission concealed critical evidence that contradicts their official stories. So, I mean, half the people are there. So I want to thank both Terry and Drew for serving as guests. I want to thank the folks who've been watching. For resources about this topic, contact the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 491-9093 or www.olyfor.org. And we just need to pursue the truth no matter where it goes. We want to thank you folks for watching, thank our guests. We're all one human family, we all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs what you have to offer. Thanks.